Qualifying instances of genuine Hermetic philosophy is not a perfect science. The term Hermetic will not always mean the same between scholars and practitioners, as history shows. Different faces of Hermetic action have been morphing since the shifty Arcadian god was born in a cave on Mount Selene. The Greek Hermes was a trickster since his first birthday, slipping away from Mother Maya in disobedience, stealing Apollo's cattle, divining music and rituals to the gods, later lying his way to Mount Olympus, securing Apollo's golden rod, and being tasked by Zeus to guide souls of the dead in the underworld. Hermes becomes no less amorphous as the centuries pass, a fact perhaps even more applicable to the term Hermetic, which has in its various uses been applied to alchemy, astronomy, astrology, arithmetic, and many more so-called Hermetic sciences, which the different versions of the god Hermes have, over time, presided over or invented as the traditions go. But Hermetic, Hermetism, and Hermeticism in this essay are used in their sincerest sense to refer to the teachings and writings authored by or ascribed to any version of the Hermes Trismegistus and the practices and rituals immediately derived therefrom. Hermetic will also apply to those earlier recipients of Hermetica, the philosophers who have proven in their writings to be familiar with Hermetica in the corpus, and those Hermetica that have not survived. Hermetism's front-runner philosopher, who demonstrates a familiarity with the texts in the Corpus Hermeticum and an inner understanding of the secret Hermetic teachings and traditional Egyptian priestly literature, is none other than the Syrian-born Iamblichus, living from around 242 to 325 AD. As a genuine Hermetic philosopher, Iamblichus is joined by his contemporary, the alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis. The two ancient wisdoms and sciences to Zosimos are the Egyptian and the Hebrew. Quote, both originate in olden times. Their origin is without a king, autonomous and immaterial. It is not concerned with material and corruptible bodies. It operates without submitting to strange influences, supported by prayer and divine grace. The symbol of chemistry is drawn from the creation by its adepts, who cleanse and save the divine soul bound in the elements, and who free the divine spirit from its mixture with the flesh. Making claims about the beliefs of ancient Egyptian priests and what they took the philosophic path of Hermes to be is better done by the priests themselves. Attaining the writings of such priests necessitates groping at very old records. However, when we have few reasons to doubt a source, we must at last surrender to what is being said, admitting, however, that we do not speak the language, and our best chance at finding the intended meaning in the words comes through translation, where we place our faith in scholars who have already shown from time to time to leave a pile of mistakes behind while etching out the diamonds that remain. One Egyptian who has influenced how we understand the Thoth to Hermes Trismegistus transition is Petosiris, the chief prophet of Thoth in Hermopolis around the end of the 4th century BC, at the start of the Macedonian dominion in Egypt. Petosiris achieved local renown, having repaired and established temples and protected his city. In the tomb of Petosiris, every witness to the tomb is told to, quote, "Come, let me lead you to the way of life, that you may reach the abode of generations, without coming to grief. Serving God is the good way. Blessed is he whose heart leads him to it. For I have come here to the city of eternity, having done the good upon the earth, having filled my heart with God's way." The way of life for the followers of Thoth at this time already indicates ethical conduct and divine service as two great requisites for the immortal way. Divine service is also implied by the conduct of the author of the first text in the Corpus Hermeticum, in the Poemandries, where at the end of the dialogue Hermes Trismegistus goes forth to teach others that they may take a share of immortality. Hermes' divine service at the end of the Poemandries is his instruction and teachings that follow. While it is probable that members of the earlier Thoth cult advanced various ways or modes of life prior to the Macedonian rule in Egypt, it is also likely that these ways of life were subject to changes. Such changes might give us a reason as to why different Hermetica offer different teachings, as the scholars Fowden and Meyer proposed. It is not that a single coherent school taught concurrent, contradictory teachings, but that over time, the essential core of the Thoth cult and Hermetic teachings progressed through different stages. Much as Iamblichus mentions, there have been various theological distinctions and idiosyncrasies related to the first principle taught by the scribes of old. After all, in Corpus Hermeticum 16, we find a warning given to King Ammon by Asclepius, saying, "My teacher, Hermes, often speaking to me in private, sometimes in the presences of Thoth, used to say that those reading my books would find their organization very simple and clear when, on the contrary, it is unclear and keeps the meaning of its words concealed." In this same text, Asclepius laments that the writings of Hermes will be translated into Greek, which will result in even more confusion. We must admit, therefore, that the effort to find a coherent philosophical path given in step-by-step instructions in the Hermetica is imperfect. We cannot accurately know which text came before the other in every case, or how the students actually managed the contradictions between Hermetica. It is a natural result, after many years of Hermetic or Thoth cult writings, to encounter contradictory teachings or internal tensions like those we find in the Korikazmu. Internal tensions that are not so great so as to change the entire scope of Hermetic teachings, but which offer variations perhaps more adaptable to certain changes in local communities, the introduction of new foreign rulers and peoples, or the death of current priests and prophets, and the rise of new ones with new additions to older doctrines. There are also some challenges in parsing out what are purposely enigmatic teachings in Hermetica, which Hermes admits to, and what are secret or otherwise esoteric teachings plainly stated, such as those found in the Hermetic doctrine of rebirth. Nonetheless, the Hermetic texts are more concerned with spiritual salvation than with doctrinal orthodoxy. It will be our task to notice what general instructions of the authentic Hermetic philosophy exist without necessarily claiming each instance can be interwoven into an accurate tapestry of the Hermetic path. By the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, beginning in 282 BC, an Egyptian priest, Manetho, already refers to two Hermeses, saying that the second Hermes, Trismegistus, was Ptolemy II's ancestor. By this time, Manetho was already crediting Hermes Trismegistus with an extraordinary amount of writings, and says that Thoth had been the first Hermes, and had inscribed a stelae in Syria in the sacred hieroglyphic letters after the flood. However, since we only know of Manetho's writings through extracts and references from later authors, scholars are hesitant to recognize the account of Manetho as the first instance of the Trismegistus epithet. The earliest known surviving Egyptian or Greek instance of the triple form title for the god Thoth occurs in 172 BC, when an Egyptian man and servant of Thoth, Hor of Sabinitus, took minutes on a meeting of the Ibis cult. Hor is familiar with the path of life led by the instructions of Thoth, and he condemns those who have abandoned the path, which Hor states he has not abandoned. The idea then is that such a path must have existed in Egypt before the established dates of the earliest Hermetic texts. In the demotic dialogue of the so-called Book of Thoth, we find instances of secret knowledge and signs of Thoth, and, quote, the place of the servants of Thoth, which precede the writer's request to see heaven, or rather the writer's observation that once certain steps are taken, seeing heaven is the expected result. It is once again more unlikely that an authentic Egyptian philosophy did not greatly influence the Hermetica from the outset. By the early 1st century AD, Thrasyllus, a famous astrologer for Emperor Tiberius, observed the Trismegistus epithet, which is now the first recognized Greek instance of the Trismegistus title. However, astrological writings authored by Hermes were known in the 2nd century BC, a tradition the Roman poet and astrologer Manilius continues, giving thanks to Hermes for undertaking the gigantic task of revealing the mysteries of the stars. Quote, "Thanks to you, we know the farther reaches of the sky, the constellations, the names and movements of the stars, their importance and their influence." For this essay, we are more concerned, however, with the Hermetic path to salvation as stated in the Hermetica. As we've seen in the previous video of our reading through the Poemandries, the first text in the corpus, the entrance of the soul into the body gives way to the soul's corruption with pain and pleasure. Unlike certain Gnostic dualistic teachings, however, this Hermetic descent was not initially the result of a mistake or a corrupting entity, but a kind of romance between the first man and nature, whose mingling later gave way to the opportunity of corruption and straying from the path. From here on in the Hermetic mythological worldview, mankind is twofold, mortal in body but immortal in our essential nature. Even at this early stage, we can determine that Hermetic salvation will require an alienation from the cloudy desires and emotions, which Corpus Hermeticum 13 identifies as 12 in number. As we will see, the Hermetic Rebirth is not an outright escapist pursuit to fly from the world, to essentially die into cosmic rebirth and shun all activity in the material world, but this rebirth is an embodiment of various ethical principles, meditative and ritualistic practices, hymns, intellectual frameworks, and ultimately culminates in a visionary or an out-of-body experience and a preceding unity with the fundamental noetic light and life that pervades the universe. The notion of a Hermetic philosophic path, or as it is known today, a way of Hermes, has eluded readers of Hermetica for centuries. It took the finding of the Hermetic text, the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, which was discovered with the rest of the Gnostic texts in the Nag Hammadi codices, before it really hit home that with the Hermetists, we are likely dealing with a mystery cult with voluminous books, rituals, songs, and prayers. One viewpoint has been that the Hermetic priesthood was an imposition of Platonism, Gnosticism, and other schools of thought onto Egyptians under the Roman Empire, and cannot represent any native Egyptian teaching. On the contrary, however, Garth, Fowden, Christian Bull, Professor Hanegraaff, and many others have conclusively demonstrated that Hermetism inherited an original, multiform but eroded Egyptian religion, which the priesthoods of Thoth gradually Hellenized, as Greek thinkers came into Egypt, hungry for that ancient wisdom teaching, which they suspected to have first informed Pythagoras and Plato. Our first text of the Corpus Hermeticum, titled the Poemandries, provides another insight into the Egyptian nativity of the Hermetica. Best efforts have shown that the name Poemandries derives from the deified Egyptian king Poemanres, whose cult existed in the Fayum in the 1st century BC. Iamblichus, an admitted follower of the Hermetic philosophy, writes of the similar deity Clement of Thebes. It is noteworthy to observe that when the Greek geographer and historian Strabo traveled to Thebes in the 1st century BC, he indicated the priests of Thebes ascribed their astronomy and philosophy to Hermes. Therefore, from the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD, we have, from Strabo to Iamblichus, a period when it was known that Hermes was the tutelary god of the Egyptian priesthood. Iamblichus famously tells us, quote, "Hermes, the god who presides over language, was formerly very properly considered as common among priests. Hence our ancestors dedicated the inventions of their wisdom to this deity, inscribing all their own writings with the name of Hermes." Even earlier than Strabo, however, we find Plato referring to Thoth as the inventor of writing and referring to Hermes as having to do with interpretation. It appears indeed, excellent Hermogenes, that those who first established names were no despicable persons, but men who investigated sublime concerns, and were employed in continual meditation and study." Unquote. In the same dialogue, Plato says of Hermes, "Thus name seems to pertain to discourse, and to imply that this god is an interpreter and a messenger, one who steals and is fraudulent in discourse, and who meddles with merchandise. And the whole of this subsists about the power of discourse. This name, therefore, is composed both from to speak and to deliberate." Iamblichus, in his biography of Pythagoras, would also have us believe Pythagoras was not ignorant of the Egyptian deity who established the names and writing. Quote, "Further, Pythagoras observed that he who is called the wisest of all, who arranged the human voice, and in short was the inventor of names, whether he was a god or a divinity or a certain divine man, or in special animals such as the ibis, ape, or dogs." Iamblichus was clearly not ignorant of Plato's stance on Thoth in the Philebus, where Plato regards the Egyptian Thoth as, quote, "some god, or rather, some god-like man." In fact, when Iamblichus assumes the pseudonym of an Egyptian priest, Abamen, taking a form of a typical Hermetic master to pupil instruction, Iamblichus reports that Plato and Pythagoras constituted their philosophy from ancient pillars of Hermes, which they found in Egypt. Quote, "If also you should propose any philosophic inquiry, we shall discuss it for you according to the ancient pillars of Hermes, which Plato and Pythagoras knew before, and from thence constituted their philosophy." This should suffice to show the weight of the connection between the Hermetic teachings and the Platonic tradition. There are clear instances in the Hermetica of Platonic influence, much as Iamblichus himself is later following in the path of ascension laid out by Hermes, while being a master of Platonism in his own right. Couple this with Philobiblius's reference to the books of the ancient Phoenician Thothus, the Egyptian Thoth, Plutarch's mention of the books of Hermes, Clement of Alexandria's account of a Hermetic procession, where an organized Hermetic priesthood carry wide-ranging books authored by Hermes, and then take, of course, Manetho's account of the many books of Hermes, and it suffices to show that Hermetica of one sort or another were circulating at least by the 3rd century BC, and would continue to be written perhaps as late as the early 3rd century AD. By no means can we say that all Hermetica that ever existed are still in possession. It is rather far more likely that we are lacking hundreds of Hermetic writings. But from those we can access, our task is to determine what practices and teachings exist in the Hermetica to lead the soul to salvation. In speaking about Egyptian theology, Iamblichus makes it clear that ascension plays a major part. Quote, "They certainly do not just speculate about these things. They recommend rising up through priestly theurgy toward the higher and more universal levels above fate, to the god and craftsman, and without material attachment or any other help at all, except observing the proper time. Hermes also gave instruction in this way, which Bittis, the prophet, translated for King Amun, after finding it carved in hieroglyphic letters in shrines of Sais in Egypt. In the first place, we must remember that following the out-of-body visionary ascent of Hermes in the Poemandries, Hermes goes forth to become a guide to his kind, and teaches his pupils the words for how to be saved and in what manner, sowing words of wisdom which are received as ambrosial nourishment. We also see a definite path that can be strayed from, with dire consequences. To stray from the path of salvation is to allow the avenging daimons and the profane human emotions to lead us here and there into oblivion, like the thrashing and sweaty chaos of the falling souls in Plato's Phaedrus. In Corpus Hermeticum 10, we learn the soul is sullied by the grossness of the body, even though in children, who have not yet succumbed to the lesser densities, all who look at them can tell how pure they still are, for they are still, quote, depending closely on the soul of the cosmos. There is established at once the downward tendency of the body and worldly concerns, whereas the soul and the mind tend upward to connect to the divine parent, the true person who must take a seat behind our eyes for us to be reborn. Much as Hermes in Corpus Hermeticum 13 tells Thoth he is not the same person he was before his vision in the Poemandries. He is now estranged from the world and rising, which is an inverse perspective from that of the growing child, who is more estranged from their spiritual parent and falling further into body. What is it precisely that the Hermetic candidate is taught they must overcome to embody this salvific ascension? Our best case for discovering the Hermetic doctrine of rebirth comes from Corpus Hermeticum 13, which is internally connected to the Poemandries dialogue, somewhat narratively fulfilling the end of the Poemandries when we read of Hermes going forth after his vision to share his gnosis. Corpus Hermeticum 13 begins with Thoth beseeching Hermes to teach him the discourse on being born again, for Hermes had agreed beforehand to teach him this, and had previously spoken in riddles. Since Hermes says no one can be saved unless they are born again, Thoth naturally seeks to learn for himself so that he may be saved. Thoth has prepared himself for this discourse, and this appears to be a condition. For Hermes was only going to teach him this higher mystery when he is, quote, about to become a stranger to the cosmos. To begin with, Hermes references the wisdom of understanding in silence, a silence which we will find is inseparable from the Hermetic method of salvation. Thoth repeatedly demonstrates his confusion and frustration with how ambiguous Hermes' teachings have been on this point. Thus Hermes opens up to his questions, picking up where Poemandries ended. For Hermes occupies the place or the state in which Thoth now seeks. Hermes is reborn and yet is here before Thoth's eyes, in the cosmos, but not of it. Quote, "What can I say, my child?" says Hermes. "I have nothing to tell except this, seeing within me an unfabricated vision that came from the mercy of God. I went out of myself into an immortal body, and now I am not what I was before. This thing cannot be taught, nor can it be seen through any elementary fabrication that we use here below. Now you see me with your eyes, my child, but by gazing with bodily sight, you do not understand what I am. I am not seen with such eyes." Thoth then claims to be quite mad and now deranged in his heart, asking who the progenitor of rebirth is and what is really true, confessing that his awareness of Hermes' understanding has been blocked. Hermes says, "How can you understand it through the senses, something only understood through its power and energy, yet requiring one empowered to understand the birth in God?" Recall the famous Hermetic aphorism in Corpus Hermeticum 11, quote, "If you have not made yourself like God, you are not able to understand God, for like is only understandable to like." Thoth asks, "Am I without the power then, Father?" Hermes says, "May it not be so, quote, draw into yourself, and it will come. Will it, and it happens. Suspend the perceptions of the body, and there will be generation of divinity. Cleanse yourself from the irrational avengers of matter." Here we come to the identification of what must be removed, like weighty garments, before the lightness of the soul can rise. These are similar to when Hermes ascended in the Poemandries and removed various worldly needs and desires from every sphere his soul ascended. In the present text, Corpus Hermeticum 13, these irrational torments of matter are identified as 12 avengers, connected with the zodiac, that, quote, use the prison of the body to torture the inward person with the sufferings of sense. To list them under no ambiguous terms, the 12 avengers are, in the order Hermes gives them, ignorance, grief, incontinence, lust, injustice, greed, deceit, envy, treachery, anger, recklessness, and malice. Of these avengers, Hermes says, "Yet they withdraw, if not all at once, from one to whom God has shown mercy, and this is the basis of rebirth, the means and method." After this, Hermes instructs Thoth to remain silent and rejoice so as not to obstruct the teaching. For the 12 avengers can be dissolved one by one, if not all at once, by the reception of the decad, or the 10 powers. In order, these powers, reduced to 7, are gnosis, knowledge of God, which if received in first-hand experience dismisses ignorance, and joy, which repulses grief instantly, continence, which might be compared to temperance or abstinence, perseverance, which dispels lust, justice over injustice, liberality as opposed to greed, and truth, which we can imagine would overcome deceit and the other avengers of envy, treachery, anger, recklessness, and malice. To be reborn in this case necessitates the death of a previous version of the self who lives through the senses. Following this teaching, Thoth is made tranquil by God, and we find an immediate expansion of Thoth's consciousness. I no longer picture things with the sight of my eyes, says Thoth, but with the mental energy that comes through the powers. I am in heaven, in earth, in water, in air. I am in animals, in plants, in the womb, before the womb, after the womb, everywhere. And later, quote, Father, I see the universe and I see myself in mind. Hermes explicitly entrusts Thoth with this discourse and tells him to avoid casting it before the mob, but rather to give it to those who God has chosen to see it. Here we find the Hermetic secrecy we might expect to find in other contemporary mystery cults, with an inner and outer arcanum. Coming after Thoth's eagerness to ascend, it is with no easy choice that Hermes proceeds to divulge a sacred hymn, and then instructs Thoth to position himself in the proper way for the hymn to be sung. Quote, Therefore, my child, stand in the open air, face the south wind when the setting sun descends, and bow down in adoration. When the sun returns, bow likewise toward the east. Be still, child. Here we find an example of the suspected Hermetic ritualism enacted by the priesthood. I emphasize the request for silence and stillness as repeating Hermetic precursors to the manner of tranquility and noiselessness of mind, which bestows a state of being conducive to the salvific ascension. If any of the 12 avengers are clouding the mind and life of the initiate, and the mercy of God or discipline of the candidate has not dispelled them, this ascension is simply unavailable. In the following hymn to the Lord of creation, the universe, and the One, Hermes, as the singer, proclaims the creator of all nature to be the mind's eye itself. The singer bequeaths the powers to join him, consequentially unifying the descended divine primal man with the man now reborn, completing a cycle as implied by, quote, Your counsel goes forth from you, and to the universe returns. The Hermetic initiate is recognizing himself in the actual act of creation, recognizing that as a soul in the universe, he too exists without beginning and is unified with the One, despite the illusions of physical rebirth and mortality. We have in the hymn, quote, Open, O earth, and Open, you heavens, and be still, you winds. This phrasing of calling the heavens and earth to open has roots at least by the time of the New Kingdom temple hymns, back to the 16th century in ancient Egypt. Although we do not have the time to cover the entire text and the various kernels of esoteric instruction and implications, Hermes concludes by asking Thoth to promise to be silent about this miracle and to not reveal this tradition. The hymn of rebirth is similar to an invocation of cosmic forces in the Great Paris Magical Papyrus, a collection of incantations of a magician in ancient Egypt, the papyrus itself dating to the early 4th century A.D. In Corpus Hermeticum 13, we find Thoth identifying with the all-pervading nous of the world, the culmination, therefore, of the ritual and philosophic instructions for the Hermetic pupil is an alienation from the desires of the senses, the employment of the 10 powers against the 12 avengers, and a visionary ascent wherein the initiate is unified with the noetic light of the universe, perceiving itself in the consciousness of all things, including the primordial hermaphroditic soul who first mingled with feminine nature. This reaffirms that Hermetic ascent is a counter-movement from multiplicity to unity against the original descent, which moved from unity to multiplicity. Beyond dispelling the 12 avengers with the decad and liberating oneself from the cyclic turmoil of sense delusions, We also find silence, stillness, and an implied purification for the candidate, and periods of preparation in order to advance to greater teachings. This calls to mind all of the other preparatory purifications and fasting we know candidates of other mystery cults at this time engaged in. Lucius, in Apuleius's Metamorphosis, undergoes immersion, lustration, and fasting for 10 days before being initiated into the mysteries of Isis and Osiris. The Pythagoreans were said to live for 2 to 5 years in silence, and Chaeremon, the Stoic of Alexandria in the 1st century, relates that Egyptian priests prepared for their important rituals with fasting, abstinence, and lustrations, sometimes for up to 42 days. A result of this kind of discipline, coupled with the after effect of visionary ascension, can be found at the end of Poemandres, when Hermes states, quote, "The closing of my eyes became true vision, and my silence became pregnant with good things." Much as the reborn Thoth states he no longer sees with his physical eyes, we find this expanded in other Hermetica, namely Corpus Hermeticum 4, where we read from Hermes, "If your vision is sharp, and you understand it with the eyes of your heart, believe me, child, you shall discover the road that leads above, or rather, the image itself will show you the way. For the vision of it has a special property. It takes hold of those who have had the vision and draws them up, just as the magnetic stone draws iron, so they say. This way of Hermes achieves a vision such that the vision itself is the guide of ascension. Hermes, we will remember, asks how such a thing can be taught, emphasizing not a blind faith or a trust in spiritual authority, but a lived, direct experience of the initiate, such that the truth is received in silence beyond the senses. As in Corpus Hermeticum 10, when we read, "At the moment when you have nothing to say about it, you will see it, for the knowledge of it is divine silence and suppression of all the senses." And later in the same text, the same thing also happens to those who leave the body. When the soul rises up to itself, the spirit is drawn into the blood, the soul into the spirit, but the mind, since it is divine by nature, becomes purified of its garments, and takes on a fiery body, ranging about everywhere, leaving the soul to judgment and the justice it deserves. What more can be learned about this exalted, ascended consciousness, the experience of which typifies the Hermetic salvation, wherein the initiate realizes and knows beyond doubt that he or she is inseparable from the immortal, hypercosmic God? More than the emphasis on meditative silence and stillness, which liberates us from the trappings of the senses, and the replacement of negative emotions and thinking with their antithesis, we find implied instances of visualization techniques that we can practice to harmonize our imaginations with the omniscient capability of the ascended consciousness, while still embodied in the mortal life. In Corpus Hermeticum 11, we read, as a teaching of mind to Hermes, quote, "Having conceived that nothing is impossible to you, consider yourself immortal, and able to understand everything, all art, all learning, the temper of every living thing. Go higher than every height, and lower than every depth. Collect in yourself all the sensation of what has been made, of fire and water, dry and wet. Be everywhere at once, on land, in the sea, in heaven. Be not yet born, be in the womb, be young, old, dead, beyond death. And when you have understood all these at once, times, place, things, qualities, quantities, then you can understand God. But if you shut your soul up in the body and abase it and say, 'I understand nothing, I can do nothing, I fear the sea, I cannot go up to heaven, I do not know what I was, I do not know what I will be,' then what have you to do with God?" For the Hermetic priesthood, the consciousness of man is the divine feature within us. It has the power to do effectively all that God can do, but is admittedly limited by the constriction of the body. By making one's mind more akin to God's and more akin to the consciousness the candidate could experience upon a mystical ascent, was therefore a sure method of Hermetic gnosis, and, in actuality, is the initiate's recognition of the full breadth of their consciousness. This prescription of the imagination opens our eyes to the radical transformation of Hermetic Rebirth and visualization as a practice of liberating oneself from negative desires and, therefore, apprehending God. It is still unclear to me if scholars have identified a major difference between the out-of-body, mystical ascent of Hermes in the Poemandries and the more visual and conceptual rebirth as delivered to Thoth in Corpus Hermeticum 13. In my view, the ascent and vision of Trismegistus in the Poemandries does not compare to Thoth's reception of the teaching of rebirth in Corpus Hermeticum 13. At the end of the Poemandries, Hermes begins proclaiming to mankind, "Make yourself sober and endure drunken sickness, for you are bewitched in unreasoning sleep." We could imagine that with any mystically oriented institution, it would be close to impossible to initiate every individual into the same experience, which would convey equal degrees of knowing on the initiate. This is why the Hermetic teacher confirms much of this knowledge will be received as soon as it should be by the mercy of God. 2 initiates could read through all the books of Hermes and sing as many hymns and make as many speech offerings and prayers to the gods as they like, and yet come out with 2 uniquely different experiences. Alas, we do not know enough about the organization of the Hermetic Priesthood to know how the high priest might have managed this situation. On the one hand, we have a genuine mystical ascent of Trismegistus, and wonder if such a mystical ascent in the out-of-body state must take place before a hermetist has reached the culmination of the Hermetic path. On the other hand, we have the conveyed knowledge through the dialogues and the encouragement of Hermes to his pupils that rebirth can occur once the 12 Avengers are dismissed by the Decad, and with a certain behavioral prescription of morals, silence, stillness, and visualization. Then again, we could be in a situation where the Hermetic master who has experienced profound out-of-body states is not out of the bounds of his priestly guidelines to proclaim that a suppliant has been reborn on the basis of cleaning the slate of the senses and remaining still and silent, reverential with prayer and hymns, to the point of creating a wealth of potential energy, which may then result in the mystical ascent such as Trismegistus underwent in the Poemandries. With these curiosities and many more aside, we can still identify various means of Hermetic salvation, and observe how the mortal world is not something to be escaped by the Hermetist, but rather the individual must embody the Hermetic ethos while in the world, so that they see things not as they appear, but as they are. The social implications of Hermes in the Poemandries, going forth to spread the word of his vision and what he has learned from Nous, causes us to speculate further on the principles of divine service which the Hermetic priests may have commonly pursued to fulfill their roles. It was not enough that Hermes learned what he did and shut himself away in the temple, but now the greater task of sobering up those in ignorance stood before him. For the last thing Poemandries said to Hermes is this question: having learned all this, should you not become guide to the worthy, so that through you the human race might be saved by God? Fortunately, many teachings in the Hermetica do not require exhaustive analysis, as we have seen. To ascertain a step-by-step Hermetic instruction through degrees is not something we find in Hermetica without making educated guesses, caveated by the potential oversights we don't even know we're making with the text. Hermeneutics fits neatly into this situation and is a term derived from Hermes in the god's interpretive capacity. The cycle of hermeneutics applied to the Hermetica is the idea that in reading and rereading a text, new meanings will rise to the surface, and the text will reflect more and more of who the reader is. We wonder how much of this interpretive flexibility was allowed for the Hermetic initiate. Was there a point in the initiation where all instruction was over, and the individual must go it alone, like Hermes in the Poemandries, and directly confront the divine nous. If this is the case, it stands to reason that there was room for individualization within the Hermetic priesthoods of later antiquity. An initiate could collect the tools, readings, hymns, and techniques and go out into the desert or the depths of the temple or in the privacy of their home and achieve a visionary experience fully vindicated by the priesthood and not scorned as the result of profane or demonic forces, but empowered to become equal to the master and even to know that in essence their soul is unified with God the Father of all. For as Poemandries says, this is the final good for those who have received knowledge, to be made God. The Hermetica may not be as laboriously complex at times as Plato or Plotinus, but this is to their advantage. If they are interpreted to be soteriological and therefore methods of salvation, they might very well have skirted the abstractions and intellectual rigors of Platonism and be seen to get more directly to the point. The theological stances the Hermetic authors maintained would not have appealed to a religious mass whose spiritual beliefs were predicated on faith alone, but to an esoteric minority, keen to experience the nous as it exists within and without the universe, and liberate themselves from the trappings of sensual desires, finding internal tranquility of heart and mind, and recognizing God in the expansion of their thoughts, and the blissful joy which dispels all grief and proclaims the soul to be an immortal aspect of a singular divine consciousness. The discourse on the 8th and 9th, the Hermetic text being studied by Christians side by side with a garden variety of non-canonical apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, also relates the unified God who, quote, has created everything, who, being self within self, supports everything, being perfect, the invisible God to whom one speaks in silence. This essay has covered a few of the Hermetic teachings related to the soul's salvation and liberation from the sensual appetites which cause souls to turn downward into matter until their divine natures are forgotten in the dregs of desire. As this channel grows, we will continue to review the Hermetica and relevant Hermetic scholarship, including the insights of Iamblichus, to determine what his contribution has been to the Hermetic salvation. Please like and subscribe and consider supporting the Patreon linked below in the description. This helps keep the channel active and really contributes to the quality of the work. Bless you and thank you.